The killer robot. Despite being a century old at this point, it remains a common enough trope in science fiction. It can range from armies of faceless enemies that you don't feel sympathy for, like the Geth in the first Mass Effect game or the battle droids in the Star Wars prequels, to full-fledged characters with ideologies and even personality, like HAL 9000, Ultron, or IG-88. And yet, of all the cold, steel-clad killers the genre has seen fit to produce, none remains more recognizable or more iconic than the Terminator, a robotic assassin concealed inside a flesh and blood endoskeleton, designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to hunt down and terminate its designated target. As a machine, the Terminator is arguably the perfect assassin. After all, it can't be bargained with, it can't be reasoned with. It feels neither pity, remorse, or fear, and it absolutely will not stop, ever, until its target is dead. Of course, this does raise more than a few questions. Of all killer robots, why this one? Of all the 80s action films and franchises now declared as classics, does this one stand out? Why is it that even 30 years later, fans are still so passionate about this franchise that the most recent bungle has hit them like a slap in the face? Why do we care about the Terminator? First things first, the origin story. The year was 1982. James Cameron, who was relatively new to filmmaking at the time, was working as special effects director in Rome on the set of Piranha 2. At some point during the production, Cameron fell ill and had a fever dream of a skeletal-looking robot assassin emerging from a blazing fire. This image stuck with him, and after finishing work on Piranha 2, Cameron resolved that this would be his next project, and he would call it The Terminator. When his agent told him that he didn't like the concept and that Cameron should work on something else instead, Cameron fired his agent. Sorry, I just think that's kind of funny. Anyway, in order to fund this new pet project of his, Cameron turned to an old friend, Gail Ann Hurd, whom he knew back in the days when she'd been an assistant to Cameron's mentor, the famed independent filmmaker Roger Corman. Cameron even went so far as to sell the film rights to Hurd for $1 if it would mean he would get to be the director. Calling in a few favors from old friends, Hurd managed to convince Orion Pictures to distribute the film and the Helmdale Film Corporation to finance the project. There were some issues with casting, including Mel Gibson and Sylvester Stallone both turning down the role of the time traveler Kyle Reese, but at last Cameron and co. had settled on their main trio of actors: Linda Hamilton, Michael Biehn, and a relative newcomer to film, fresh off the success of his debut role of Conan the Barbarian, a certain muscle-bound Austrian by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Production began in 1983, and despite several setbacks, including Cameron being drafted to write the script for Rambo 2, The Terminator premiered in theaters on October 26, 1984, and the rest, as they say, is history. Terminator is now one of the most recognizable and beloved action franchises ever made. For the sake of this video, I'm going to restrict myself to the first 2 Terminator films, and not address any of the mediocre, and worse, sequels that followed. 1, because positivity is the point of these Why Do We Care videos, and 2, I don't think Terminator fans need any further reminders at this point as to how bad Genesis and Dark Fate are. With that said, let's begin. First, a quick summary for those who might be new to these films and don't particularly care about spoilers. In the not-too-distant future, humanity successfully develops artificial intelligence, this time going by the name of Skynet. Unsurprisingly, Skynet decides that humans are the problem and decides to eliminate them all with nukes. Fortunately, Skynet fails to wipe out humanity entirely, and a resistance movement led by a man named John Connor successfully defeats it. But before it can be destroyed, Skynet somehow invents time travel and sends a cyborg assassin known as a Terminator back to the 1980s in order to kill John Connor's mother Sarah, thus preventing his birth and Skynet's ultimate defeat. The rebels are unable to prevent this, and so John Connor sends one of his soldiers, Kyle Reese, back to the same time period to act as Sarah's protector. In the end, both Reese and the Terminator are destroyed, though not before Reese falls in love with Sarah and impregnates her, thus making him John Connor's father. In the sequel, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, things get complicated because of time travel. Apparently, Skynet decided that one Terminator might not be enough, and so sends a second Terminator, the new and highly experimental T-1000, back to the 1990s to assassinate John Connor as a child. This time, the rebels counter by sending a captured and reprogrammed T-800 Terminator, identical to the one from the first film, back in time to act as John Connor's protector. Thus, the sequel is an epic fight of Terminator versus Terminator, and our heroes see a chance to prevent the titular Judgment Day by tracking down the inventor of Skynet and preventing its creation. The Terminator films are primarily remembered as action movies, but the truly interesting thing here is that the first two films, especially the first, are in many ways a hybrid of two very popular film styles in the 1980s. The bombastic, over-the-top 80s action movie and the slasher flick. This makes perfect sense, especially when you consider the fact that Cameron was good friends with John Carpenter, the creator of Michael Myers, one of the first and arguably most famous of the slasher villains. Maybe it's because of its face turn in the second movie, but I'm sometimes surprised that the T-800 is never counted among the great slasher villains, like Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger. The horror elements are noticeably toned down in the sequel in favor of a greater emphasis on the action, but in the first film, the emphasis is firmly on the suspense, the threat that the T-800 poses to the heroes, and just how utterly helpless they are against it. Really, the only other films I can think of that so perfectly blend action and horror in this way are Aliens and the first Predator film. Often films that try to blend two different genres together tend to fail rather miserably, but The Terminator is that rare, wonderful exception. Next. Of course, you can't talk about any Terminator film worth its salt without mentioning the one and only Arnold Schwarzenegger. No offense, Salvation, we all know you did your best. But let's be honest with ourselves here. When you hear the name Terminator, you don't think of Sarah Connor, or John Connor, or Kyle Reese, or any of the other Terminators like the T-1000. No, in your mind's eye, you see the one, the only, the Governator. He is the face of this franchise, and ironically enough, its heart and soul. Conan the Barbarian may have kickstarted Arnold Schwarzenegger's film career, but it was the Terminator films that propelled him to being one of the great 80s action movie superstars. What's interesting here is that he's technically playing two different characters in two different movies. In the first, he's a ruthless killing machine. In the second, he's a reprogrammed protector, who even gains some humanity of his own over the course of the film. While no one would ever put Arnold's acting ability on the same pedestal as, say, Laurence Olivier or Daniel Day-Lewis, I would argue that he actually acts really well in these films, at least as well as his roles require of him. That's the thing about Arnold Schwarzenegger as an actor. He seems to know the limits of his acting abilities, and either he or his agent has a knack for selecting directors who know how to use him. If you want to know more, I recommend you check out Rossitron's video, What Makes Arnold Schwarzenegger Different? Link in the description. Anyway, in both films, his stilted, minimal dialogue really sells you on the idea that he's a robot.
Nice night for a walk.
Wash day tomorrow. Nothing clean, right?
Nothing clean, right?
While in the sequel, he gets to develop as a character. And even some of the moments that would otherwise seem too goofy or off-putting, like when he smirks after finding the minigun, makes sense because he's new to this whole emotion thing. But the thing that really sells him in this role, at least for me, is just the way he looks. His height, his muscular physique, both really add to his intimidation factor, and you can really believe that this guy is an unstoppable weapon of destruction. And speaking of the unstoppable Arnold, the first Terminator is what I like to call a lean and mean type of movie. It didn't have either the budget or the special effects of Judgment Day, but it did have a team that knew exactly how to use every shred of their resources, how to squeeze every last drop of blood from the proverbial stone. Because of its low budget, the first film veers more in the direction of suspense, and thus doesn't have nearly as many action set pieces as Judgment Day. In fact, it really has only 3: the initial car chase, the police station massacre, and the climax. If you were to ask me which one is best, I would have to go with the police station massacre. First, because we get to hear Arnold deliver perhaps his most famous line,
I'll be back.
but more importantly because this is the scene that demonstrates to the audience just how deadly and unstoppable the Terminator really is. By this point in the film, we know that Arnold has killed at least 6 people. 2 other women who happen to be named Sarah Connor, the owner of the gun store, Sarah's roommate, Sarah's roommate's boyfriend, and one of the punks at the beginning played by the late Bill Paxton. But the thing is, these were all helpless victims. Or relatively helpless. Bill Paxton at least had a switchblade, which, to be fair, probably wouldn't work against a cyborg assassin, or simply against Arnold Schwarzenegger for that matter. But anyway, the point is, the police station scene is the first time the Terminator comes against actual armed resistance. Pretty heavily armed resistance. I'm honestly amazed that the police station was packing that much heat. But then again, this was the 80s as opposed to our modern police. And Schwarzenegger just blows through them all as if they were ducks at a shooting gallery. One guy, armed with an assault rifle and a shotgun, massacres over a dozen presumably well-trained police officers in less than 4 minutes of screen time, constantly taking fire from pistols and assault rifles, and he is barely inconvenienced long enough for Reese and Sarah to make their escape. There's really nothing else I can say except to insist that you watch the first Terminator if you haven't already. The Terminator is described as one of Skynet's deadliest agents, and this is the scene that demonstrates precisely why it is an enemy to be feared. Next. The script of The Terminator describes Sarah Connor thusly. 19. Small and delicate features. Pretty in a flawed, accessible way. She doesn't stop the party when she walks in, but you'd like to get to know her. Her vulnerable quality masks a strength even she doesn't know exists. Apart from the age thing, if that doesn't describe Linda Hamilton's performance down to a T, I defy you to find an actress that could have done a better job. For those of you who are unaware, Sarah Connor belongs to a very small but highly exclusive pantheon of action female badasses, including Imperator Furiosa, the Bride, and the OG action heroine herself, Ellen Ripley. Although, you wouldn't think it to look at her in the beginning, but then again, that's kind of the point. The story of Sarah Connor is very much that of an ordinary person just going about their life when suddenly an improbable destiny, almost literally, falls out of the sky and into their lap. Now, obviously, given the choice, I'm sure Sarah would have chosen some destiny other than being hunted by an unstoppable killer robot, with her only protector being a half-traumatized soldier from the future. So it makes perfect sense when she tells Reese flat out that she didn't ask for this.
Do I look like the mother of the future? I mean, am I tough? Organized? I can't even balance my checkbook. Look, Reese, I didn't ask for this honor, and I don't want it. Any of it.
But of course, reality doesn't really seem to care much what Sarah Connor wants. And so she has to learn to accept the reality of what's happening to her and, well, toughen up. I touched on this briefly when I talked about Arnold, but this is something that we normally don't see in classic action films. Character development. The appeal of the 80s action hero was the things they did, not the persons they were or became. You didn't watch movies like Commando or Invasion USA or Escape from New York for deep introspective character studies. You watched them to see the hero kick all of the ass and take all of the names. But in the Terminator films, we get to see Sarah Connor evolve from the girl next door to the mother of humanity. She goes from waiting on tables at a diner to learning how to make homemade explosives, kick people's asses with her bare hands, and stare down cold cyborg killers. Granted, by the sequel, she seems just as wild-eyed and half-crazed as Reese was, but given what she knows about the future, it's not hard to see why. Granted, in the sequel, Sarah plays second fiddle to John and Arnold in terms of character arcs, But even she gets some development of her own in this movie, mostly in her learning to trust again.
Come with me if you want to live.
Come with me if you want to live.
Trust this new Terminator who claims he's here to protect her son. Trust John's judgment. And even trust Dyson, the scientist who is destined to create Skynet. There's a reason why Sarah Connor is one of the great action heroines. And her story arc is one of the things that makes the Terminator movies so good. Next. Because it was such a low-budget film for its time, the first Terminator really couldn't afford to spend much on big effects. That's not to say that there were none and that they weren't any good. Most of the effects are actually pretty great, mostly prosthesis and animatronics for the Terminator itself. The only effect that has really shown its age at this point is the stop motion used in the climax of the first film, after the Terminator's disguise, quote-unquote, has been burnt away. And even then, the effect isn't bad, just obvious. But let's be honest, folks, there's a reason why Terminator 2 Judgment Day took the Oscar for Best Visual Effects in 1991. It looks amazing. The sequel was given over 15 times the budget of the original, and you can see that in the first scene, which takes place in the future. Just look at this scene, my friends. Drink it in. It's like the movie is flaunting its budget in our faces like a model on a runway. And I'm perfectly fine with that. There are simply too many effect shots in this film to count that are just amazing and hold up incredibly well even 30 years later. The truck smashing through the bridge, the helicopter explosion, the whole fight in the steel mill at the conclusion, and of course, every single scene with Robert Patrick as the T-1000. Fun fact, Cameron had originally intended the T-1000 to appear in the first film alongside Arnold, 2 Terminators for the price of 1. But at the time, he didn't feel the effects technology was up to snuff to bringing to life a liquid metal assassin. A few years later, after working on a film known as The Abyss, which featured a lot of CGI water effects, Cameron decided that this newfangled technology called computer-generated imagery might succeed in bringing his creation to life in a way no practical effect ever could. That's not to say that they abandoned practical effects entirely when it came to the T-1000. They use quite a lot of practical effects with him, in fact, mostly when the T-1000 is being shot or cut in half. The CGI stepping in only when he's repairing himself or transforming himself. This combination of real and computer effects better sells the illusion that he's really there, actually inhabiting the same space as the other characters. And it works to tremendous effect. When most people talk about early CGI in films that still hold up, they point either to Terminator 2 or Jurassic Park, and it's easy to see why. If visual effects in film is about selling you on an illusion, then Terminator 2 is an illusion of a fine quality indeed. Next. But what are good films without good soundtracks? Here, credit goes to composer Brad Fiedel, who worked on both of the 2 Terminator movies. The good ones, I mean. Again, sorry, Salvation, we know you tried your best. Fiedel himself said that the theme of the Terminator soundtracks was a mechanical man and his heart, which is why most of the music sounds very subdued, electronic, and menacing, as befits a killer robot like the Terminator. In the first movie, the soundtrack leans heavily into synth music, which was very popular in the 80s, while the sequel favors a more traditional orchestral sound. But of course, we can't talk about the music of Terminator without addressing the theme. Every great movie has a theme song. Jurassic Park, Star Wars, Jaws, you name it. The Terminator theme is very low and haunting. Very slow, very bittersweet too, which is fitting since this is all about trying to avert a tragedy and not always succeeding. And then there's the part where the tempo builds and we get the 5 notes. In my opinion, these may as well just be the theme of the Terminator all by themselves. Just that, 5 notes. 5 hammering notes that say, I am the Terminator, I'll be back, and I am coming for you. It just doesn't get any better than this. This is that part of the song that everybody knows and recognizes. It's just like that first blare of trumpets at the beginning of the Star Wars theme. You hear it and you think, this is the Terminator. And if something so seemingly simple can stick in your head and still be memorable years later, then the man who composed them must have been doing something right. Hats off to you, Mr. Fidel. Next. You would think that there would be no downsides to being a story that's both good and popular. Well, unfortunately, such downsides do exist, and in the case of Terminator 2, it's the fact that everyone knows the twist. That Arnold is not reprising his role as the villain, but in fact is now one of the good guys. It's kind of like how everyone knows the ending to the first Planet of the Apes movie, or the revelation that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. It's one of those things that it's really hard to introduce a newcomer to and have them go in and experience it completely blind. And that really is a shame because Terminator 2 sets up the twist pretty well. As in the first movie, both the time travelers materialize in the buff. Naturally, their first step is to acquire supplies and information. In Arnold's case, the film confirms that he is a Terminator by showing us a few shots from his perspective. Although this time he doesn't rip the bikers' hearts out like he did with Bill Paxton, he just beats them up. Meanwhile, when Robert Patrick first appears, his perspective shot is perfectly normal, and we never see him transform or liquefy. Plus, the way the scene is shot and edited, the viewer doesn't even know if he actually killed that police officer. For all the viewer knows, Robert Patrick probably just knocked him out and then stole his clothes. Then there's the way the two actors behave. Arnold is of course hulking, silent, and menacing just like he was in the first movie, while Robert Patrick looks smaller, more innocuous, and his speech and behavior is perfectly normal and, well, human.
Are you the legal guardian of John Connor?
This has the added bonus of making him seem all the more sinister and menacing after the twist is revealed, selling you on the idea that the T-1000 is the perfect infiltration unit. John Connor being a juvenile delinquent in Terminator 2, it is natural that he would be just as suspicious of a police officer tailing him as he would be of this big, weird Austrian guy. And so the audience is left wondering what's going to happen. Who's going to catch John Connor first? And what's going to happen when they do? And then this scene happens.
Get down.
It really is a shame that so many people already know this twist before even watching the movie. Still, a good twist is a good twist, even if you already know its outcome. Next. Now here's something you don't normally see in films these days. The theme of fatherhood. Obviously, John Connor's dad, Kyle Reese, dies at the end of the first movie shortly after conceiving him. And because his mother becomes, albeit understandably, obsessed with the whole we have to do something or humanity is going to die thing, people think she's nuts and lock her up in an asylum, leaving John with foster parents who don't really get along with him very well. The big irony of Terminator 2 is, as Sarah herself points out, the fact that a killer robot turns out to be the father figure that John had always needed, someone that would always be there for him. Though you wouldn't think it at the beginning of their relationship. Initially, John treats the Terminator kind of like a slightly more intelligent guard dog. A pet, if you will, who he needs to train. Understandable, given Arnold's, lack of social graces.
No!
course, I'm a Terminator.
But over time, their relationship develops and becomes more than just a boy and his robot. Arnold proves time and again how effective a protector he is, and John teaches Arnold how to be human and even the value of life. By the third act, they've formed a friendship that feels believable. And at the end, when Arnold has to destroy himself and John is tearfully ordering him not to go, you really feel like he's losing someone important to him, the father he never really had. Whenever I find clips of the ending of Terminator 2 on YouTube and see Arnold give John that final thumbs up as he's lowered into the molten steel, I find a lot of comments reading about how they tear up whenever they see this scene. And just like in the first movie, we see the Terminator's death from the Terminator's perspective. But where in the first film we, the audience, feel triumph and relief at the death of a monster, now in the sequel we're mourning the death of a friend. I and every other snob on the internet has said it before, and I'll say it again. All the bells and whistles that a story can throw at you, from special effects to great music, mean very little if you don't care about the characters. And Terminator 2 does make you care, not just about the humans, but about a literal killer robot. Getting the audience to emotionally attach themselves to the characters is the essence of good storytelling, and Terminator 2 is a very, very good story. Next. As Arcada of Glass Reflection used to say, the ending is paramount. And both Terminator films have very good endings. They're action-packed, they're emotional, they're suspenseful. They have everything you want in a climax. The first film in particular focuses on suspense and the seeming invincibility of the T-800. You have a car crash, an explosion, the Terminator emerging from the flames in his metallic glory, just like in the original dream that inspired Cameron to begin with. It pursues our heroes on a narrow, cramped corridor. It kills Kyle Reese, and then, even after having its legs blown off, it doggedly pursues Sarah Connor through a factory until she can lure it into a hydraulic press and crushes it. Damn, what an ending! And when the machine has finally been terminated, you feel just as worn out and relieved as Sarah is. And yet her triumph is tempered by the loss of the man she loves, giving the ending the bittersweet feel that it deserves. Because Terminator 2 had a bigger scale and a bigger budget, they had to up the ante and supersize the climax as well. In fact, I make the argument that everything from the moment they go to blow up Cyberdyne, the company that's developing Skynet, to the final battle in the steel mill qualifies as the climax. And it's just as bombastic and over the top as you would want it to be. Arnold firing his minigun, the helicopter chasing them, the truck full of liquid nitrogen, seeing the T-1000 get frozen, then shattered, then blown up, then melted. That moment of doubt where the T-1000 tries to disguise itself as Sarah Connor to trap John. Seeing two Terminators duke it out hand to hand against the hellish backdrop of molten metal. They really just don't make action movies like this anymore. And just like the first movie, it ends on a hopeful but bittersweet note as Arnold bids us a final goodbye and Sarah Connor contemplates the new, hopeful future that lies ahead. Bit of a personal anecdote here. I only got around to watching Terminators 1 and 2 for the first time 1 year prior to the making of this video. All my life, I'd grown up hearing about how good these movies were, and when I finally decided to watch it, I went in with some skepticism. I was expecting them to be good, but overhyped. But by the time the credits were rolling at the end of T2, my skepticism had flown out the window. That's how good these endings are, and that's how good these movies are. Next. Terminator is a franchise that has not been treated very kindly of late. And as with all franchises that suffer from repeated bad sequels and remakes, there is a fear that the bad will outweigh the good. That newcomers will be disgusted by the bad movies and not bother to seek the ones that are worth watching. Though I am admittedly one of those more pessimistic types, the reason for this channel was to try and be a bit more optimistic about such things. Yes, we probably won't get another good Terminator film, if only because Arnold's getting old, and even if they were to make a decent movie, it wouldn't be the same without him. Yes, at the time of this video, Hollywood seems more interested in preaching messages than telling stories. But just because Dark Fate exists doesn't mean Judgment Day is cancelled out. Just because there are 4 bad sequels doesn't mean that the original will suddenly be forgotten. Great stories are only forgotten when we allow ourselves to forget them. When we throw our hands up in disgust and say, I give up. As I said earlier, I only got into Terminator recently. There are dozens of people on YouTube alone who've been fans for far longer, and who've examined these films in far greater detail than I ever could. And I feel that as long as passionate people like this remain to trumpet the praises of these movies, I think Terminator fans can rest assured that no matter how many years pass or how many mistakes the numbnuts in Tinseltown make, movies with such memorable performances, great action, and groundbreaking effects will not be buried so easily. After all, Terminators 1 and 2, especially 2, are stories about persistence, refusal to give in the face of adversity or even fate itself. It's not only why people care about the Terminator, but why we should. Thank you for watching. I'm afraid I can't get back to lore videos just yet, because given that a certain trilogy is about to conclude a few weeks from now, I think there's really only one fitting way to close out the year. I'll be posting regular updates on the Facebook page to keep you all informed of what's coming. Let's end 2019 with Why Do We Care About Star Wars? Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.